Hey folks, tonight we're diving into the wonderfully sketchy world of ancient Roman street eats. From oily thermopolia counters to honey-drenched fig cakes devoured under towering marble columns. Roman fast food wasn't just about keeping you alive. It was flavor, class, and sheer survival wrapped into one questionable sausage. So, before you get too comfortable, go ahead and like the video and subscribe button. Only if you actually enjoy what I am doing here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is there. I always find it fascinating to see this little community spread across the globe. Okay, now dim the lights, maybe switch on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's slip into tonight's journey together. Picture this, you reshuffling down a scorching Roman street in sandals that should have been retired 2 summers ago. Your tunic is clinging to all the wrong places, and your skull is throbbing with the kind of hangover that only comes from too many watered-down cups of wine and bad choices at the baths. You don't want a banquet. You're not about to roast a pig or argue about olives with your neighbor. No, you need something immediate, greasy, and possibly regrettable. Something you can hold in one hand while the other shoos away pigeons into the Thermopolium Rome's beautifully chaotic version of a grab-and-go joint. Think of it as an ancient Taco Bell, but with marble counters and absolutely zero food inspectors. The setup was straightforward. Stone counters with circular cutouts, each holding Adolium giant clay jars stuffed with whatever was still hot, edible, and hadn't poisoned anyone yet. No menus, no labels. It's just bubbling mystery pots offering both calories and questionable consequences. What's on the menu? It's cheese fritters that squeak when you chew them. Dubious sausages that might be poor core. Just hope. Okay. A stew that either had lentils or wanted you to think it did. Okay. And always lingering like a ghost was garam, that infamous fermented fish sauce which functioned as both a condiment and a dare. Cleanliness, best not to ask. The cook is wearing yesterday's tunic, and his spoon has survived at least 2 civil wars. But the food is salty, hot, and crammed with enough energy to push you through another day of not collapsing in a crowd. Thermopolia were everywhere, especially in Pompeii, where nearly every street had one. Laborers, students, poets, and baffled tourists from Gaul all crowded around, trading coins for fast food that was filling, cheap, and vaguely legal. Sure, you might regret it later, but when the choice was between a raw onion or something bubbling on the corner, you took your chances and prayed your stomach forgave you. You leave the Thermopolium, dignity dented, and toga newly stained with lentils. Wandering into the forum, your gut rumbles again. This time, you Dan. T want a meal, just a little something to gnaw while pretending to care about some loud orator rambling about grain subsidies. Enter roasted chickpeas, or in Roman Latin, Caesar Arietnum, which sounds elegant, okay, but really means rocks disguised as food. Vendors hawk them in clay bowls or little cloth pouches, shouting over each other in a noisy chorus of salesmanship. Hot chickpeas, crunchy chickpeas, chickpeas that might chip your molars. They were roasted over coals until they achieved a texture somewhere between crunchy and gravel, salted heavily because salt was the Romans' cure-all, seasoning, preservative, and cover-up for bad taste. And despite the dental hazard, chickpeas were wildly popular. Soldiers munched them on the march. Senators chewed them between bribes. Kids gnawed on them as training for adulthood. They were cheap, portable, and lasted forever. Perfect for tossing in your satchel, your lunchbox, or at someone's head during gladiator games. Variety. Nah. No chili lime, no hummus dip. Just a pouch of rock-hard legumes dusted with salt, occasionally still warm, which somehow counted as luxury. Romans swore they were healthy, said to improve digestion, strength, and brain power, though that sounds suspiciously like vendor propaganda. Every so often, you'd bite into a soft one and think, not bad. Then the next would crack your tooth, reminding you dentistry was still 1,000 years away. Still, for a few coins, you got a long-lasting snack hand in Rome that was worth the risk. But now your stomach wants something else. Something softer, sweeter, maybe less like chewing gravel. You spot a tray of golden spheres gleaming in the sunlight. The vendor grins and offers one, globally. What are they? Imagine deep-fried cheese balls drowned in honey. And no, this isn't a Renaissance fair gimmick. These were authentic Roman treats, made from fresh cheese mixed with flour, rolled into balls, fried until golden, then dunked in honey until they were sticky little sugar bombs, sweet, savory, and prone to disaster. Bite too fast and hot cheese shot across the street. The honey glued your fingers together, making you an instant magnet for bees, dogs, or awkward interactions with senators. Globally, were beloved. The recipe even appears in Apicus, Rome's closest thing to a cookbook. They were served at parties, festivals, and any gathering where you wanted to impress her. Seduced through sugar. The texture, crispy shell, molten interior. The taste, somewhere between dessert and cheesecake, gone rogue. The Romans had no chill when it came to honey, and these things were basically candied cannonballs. Not everyday street food, the oil and cheese made them a luxury, but at upscale events, they stole the show. Imagine toga parties ending with everyone groaning happily, tunics stained with cheese grease, bees buzzing overhead like unpaid waiters. One bite could be divine or a sticky nightmare. Either way, it was unforgettable. While we have donuts, churros, and fried Oreos, the Romans had globuli. Turns out deep frying dairy and sugar wasn't an invention, it was a comeback. Still craving something a bit more elegant. Something refined, less drippy. Tear Rome's take on gourmet dessert. Dates stuffed with nuts. Known in recipes as dolce domestica, these little treats looked simple but packed a punch. Take soft dates, remove the pits, stuff them with chopped almonds or walnuts, then drizzle or drown them in honey. At first glance, they seemed harmless, the kind of rustic sweet you'd proudly hand to grandma. But don't be fooled, these were dense. Dense in flavor, dense in calories, and, if left out in the sun too long, dense enough to double as bricks. Think nature's candy, weaponized. The wealthy loved flaunting them at feasts, but even workers and slaves sometimes enjoyed them during festivals when indulgence was allowed and digestive regrets were politely ignored. Eating them was an experience. The chewy date, the crunchy nut surprise, the sticky honey gluing everything together, including your teeth. Koga, and maybe your friendships if you snagged the last one. Nutritionally speaking, surprisingly decent. Dates packed natural sugar and quick energy. Nuts added a solid protein punch. And honey, well, honey just made everything feel fancy. Romans liked to brag that it helped digestion, but honestly, they were just thrilled to finally have something sweet that didn't come with bones in it. Okay. Bonus, these little treats traveled well, perfect as gifts, religious offerings, or last-minute apologies. Soldiers carried them on campaigns. Lovers passed them like edible love letters, and in a pinch, they doubled as throwable projectiles with enough heft to make a point. For an empire that conquered half the world, this was one of its favorite desserts. Sticky, satisfying, and occasionally hazardous. Now, let's veer into the slightly unhinged, because if there's one Roman delicacy that still makes modern stomachs turn, it's this: stuffed dormice. Yep, small, wide-eyed rodents that unfortunately ended up as fine dining on aristocratic Roman tables. Think of it as the ancient push and pull between luxury and why are we doing this. To be fair, not every Roman was crunching down on glorified pet hamsters. This was almost entirely a high society habit. The toga-draped elite, owners of villas and libraries of mediocre poetry, loved to serve them up as a statement. They weren't feeding guests dormice out of hunger. They did it because it screamed status. The process was absurd. Dormice were raised in special terracotta jars called Glorio, basically little hamster hotels with no exit. The goal? Fattened them up. Once plump, they were stuffed with a mix of minced pork, nuts, and herbs, then either roasted, coated in honey, or both. Because why cross one culinary boundary when you can leapfrog half a dozen? Guests would daintily pick them up, pretending not to notice the tails still dangling. Ancient writers describe the taste as nutty, which is probably code for mousy with a side of regret. And this wasn't some shady underground practice, it was regulated. That's how common it became. Romans wrote about it, laughed about it, even decorated mosaics with dormice, proudly saying, "Here lies Gaius. He had wealth. He had mice." As bizarre as it sounds, they were regarded as a delicacy, the foie gras of their time. Extravagant, controversial, and ethically questionable. Why eat them? 'Cause they could, 'cause it impressed people, because moderation wasn't really Rome's strong suit. To us, it's unsettling. To them, it was just another stylish snack. And in a culture where flamingo tongues were a menu option, a honey-roasted dormouse barely raised an eyebrow. Naturally, after that, you deserve something comforting, something golden, something that doesn't look back at you. Enter the Roman honey cake, or libum. Now, don't picture the fluffy sponge cakes of today's warrant Instagram material. Roman honey cakes were dense, solid, closer to edible bricks than pastries. They came in a range of textures, from pleasantly chewy to "where's my dagger?" The classic recipe: blend of cheese, flour, and egg kneaded into a thick dough, formed into small loaves, and baked on a leaf. Because if you're not cooking on foliage, are you even Roman? Once done, they were drenched, absolutely drowned in honey. Not drizzled, not brushed on, saturated to the point of stickiness that could ruin friendships if there was only one slice left. Honey in Rome was prized above islet, sweetened, preserved, healed, and apparently solved the problem of bland cakes. The end result was a sticky, slightly tangy, cheesy sweet block that clung to fingers, tunics, and social reputations alike. They showed up at festivals, family feasts, and offerings to the household gods, which meant your breakfast pastry might also double as a sacrifice. No pressure. Like everything else in Rome, social class made its mark here too. Poorer households used barley or rye, skipped the cheese, and watered down the honey cakes in name only. The wealthy, of course, threw in nuts, spices, and enough honey to drown a legionnaire. Still, they were beloved. The sort of food people remembered from childhood, fought over at banquets, and stashed away like secret treasures. Not elegant, not delicate, but sweet, sticky, and capable of sparking property disputes. Picture waking up in ancient Rome, the streets already buzzing, your neighbor yelling about late amphora deliveries, your head pounding from last night's just one cup of wine that became four. You're groggy, broke, and late. Breakfast. Forget fruit, eggs, or anything civilized. The classic Roman start to the day was stale bread soaked in wine. Yes, that was a thing, called sopium vinum, which sounds like sorcery, but really just means bread and wine, basically. You took yesterday's rock-hard loaf because fresh bread was costly or mysteriously absent, tore it into pieces, and soaked it in whatever half-fermented grape juice was lying around. It wasn't glamorous, but it softened the bread enough to chew. Red or white didn't matter. If it was liquid and vaguely wine-like, it worked. Sometimes people added honey or herbs, but that was more for special occasions or if you were trying to impress someone who already caught you eating dormice. It was the breakfast of efficiency. Farmers ate it before hitting the fields, laborers before carrying bricks, philosophers before sighing dramatically in public. If coffee fuels modern mornings, this was Rome's lukewarm, wine-flavored equivalent. Of course, the wealthy mocked it while secretly enjoying their own fancy versions with aged wine, sweetened bread, and the smug look of someone pretending to rough it. For the average Roman, This was where the day really began. And here's the catch. Sometimes it didn't even count as breakfast. Plenty of people simply dunked bread in wine at meals, at speeches, even while pretending not to eavesdrop in the forum. It was food, it was drink, it was a lifestyle, nutritious, barely, refined, not in the slightest. Kate, but it was soft, cheap, and laced with alcohol in Rome. That was basically a victory. Sausages. Humanity's timeless answer to the eternal problem. What do we do with the leftover scraps? Nowhere was this meat salvaging art form more celebrated than in Rome, where sausage making was less about recipes and more about stretching the definition of edible. The Roman specialty was Lucanica, a sausage named after the Lucania region. By the time it reached Roman stalls, nobody cared about origins. What mattered was that it was salty, fatty, spicy, and suspiciously chewy. As for the ingredients, well, brace yourself. Pork bits, liver, lungs, heart, and possibly a few mystery add-ins, all spiced with pepper, cumin, fennel, and confidence, stuffed into intestines, cooked on open flames, smoked, or fried, was delicious enough to distract you from the terror of what you were actually chewing, and the Romans adored them. Street vendors grilled them in public, sending plumes of smoky perfume into the already chaotic city air. Customers queued up, togas, crooked coins jingling, desperate for a greasy fix. Soldiers swore by them. Philosophers ate them and immediately doubted their own morals. Children begged for them and just as quickly regretted it. Quality varied wildly. At imperial banquets, they might be minced, fine, and elegantly seasoned. On the streets, best not to ask questions. Rumors whispered of donkey meat, maybe dog, and definitely organs you'd never see in a butcher's shop. Storage was more wishful thinking than science. Some sausages aged gracefully, others turned into health hazards you'd want to report. But still, they were everywhere. Sold in snack bars, munched in arenas, stuffed into travel packs. A Roman soldier trudging through Gaul could count on two things: blisters and a dried sausage in his pouch. Calorie dense, full of flavor, and sturdy enough to double as a club if needed. Now, Roman pancakes. Or, as you might call them, flat disappointment drizzled with hope. In principle, a libum or alateria, depending who you ask, sounded promising. Flour, eggs, milk, sometimes honey, sometimes not, which basically meant your emotions were held hostage by the cook's generosity. The batter went into a pan over a fickle fire, and something resembling a pancake. Except Roman magic produced no fluffy stacks or maple syrup. These were thin, dense, and resilient enough to serve as construction material. If you lucked out, they were fried in oil, topped with honey, maybe sprinkled with poppy seeds. If not, you got the plain version, dry, chewy, and about as appetizing as a legal document. Still, they were cheap, easy, and adaptable. Sweet or savory, hot or cold, showing up at feasts, funerals, or that vague hour between breakfast and guilt. Romans weren't seeking brunch bliss. They just wanted something that filled the stomach without fighting back. Occasionally, the edges crisped, the honey caramelized. And just for a moment, you thought, this isn't terrible. That fleeting victory was the true Roman pancake experience. Mediocrity with a side of low expectations. Finally, fish. Romans didn't fuss with delicate fillets. They went straight for the crunchy scraps. Fried, salty, occasionally identifiable. Imagine wandering the docks at Ostia, or down some back alley near the Suburra. You catch the smell, oily, fishy, sizzling. A tray of fried bits, maybe heads, tails, fins, or anything that fit in the pan. Anchovies and sardines were staples, but mystery seafood always had a chance to make an appearance. It's the process. Heat oil, toss in fish, pray they crisp before they char. Sprinkle salt, maybe vinegar, if you were feeling fancy. Serve wrapped in a fig leaf. Just dump them in someone's hand if hygiene was optional, which, let's be honest, it usually was. These crispy little sea snacks were everywhere. Sold in thermopolia, eaten at games, shared in the streets. It's crunchy, greasy, and probably older than they should have been. But in Rome, that was part of the charm. Market stalls hollered about them. Kids grabbed them as pocket change snacks. Everyone understood the unspoken rule. If it was fried long enough, you didn't need to know which part of the fish it used to be. Nutritionally, shockingly decent. Omega-3 South, protein, calcium from the bones. You were absolutely crunching like popcorn. Plus that lingering sea breeze aroma that clung to you for days. And the magic was simple. People adored it. Romans weren't chasing elegance. They wanted salt, grease, and crunch. These little fish scraps delivered loudly and unapologetically. Okay, they told your stomach, congratulations, you're fat, and your dignity. Unasked questions. By this point, you've had bread soaked in wine, sausages stuffed with unspeakables, and a pancake that could double as flooring. Maybe now you're craving something lighter, something fruity, something that whispers. Good life choice. Enter the Roman fig cake, the ancient skill of disguising leftovers as dessert. Figs were everywhere in Rome. Cheap, plentiful, so quick to spoil they had about 3 hours between ripe and fermenting. The solution: mash them up into fig cakes. Sticky little lumps of smashed figs, sometimes blended with nuts or flour, occasionally pressed into discs, and almost always marketed as a treat. The texture: boldly chewy, clingy, and suspicious if stored too long. Flavor depended entirely on freshness. Best case: rich and naturally sweet. Worst case: tangy in a way you'd politely call interesting. Honey helped when added. When not, it didn't. Some batches had sesame seeds, which clung to your molars like regret. Others were wrapped in leaves for portability and plausible deniability. Yet, despite humble origins, fig cakes became beloved across Roman society. Farmers munched them in the fields. Philosophers nibbled while passing judgment. Elites enjoyed them too, just with a dusting of spices and smugness. At festivals, they were handed out like ancient granola bars. And since they kept well, they doubled as offerings to gods, household spirits, and neighbors you couldn't stand but had to appease. Nobody sang sonnets about fig cakes, but they were filling, adaptable, and reliable, the culinary equivalent of good enough. And in a world where most desserts either glued themselves to your fingers or tried to roll off your plate, 5G cakes at least stayed put. No glamour, no drama, but also no fight. Sometimes that's all you need. By now, your Roman food tour has included enough fermented, fried, and honey-coated oddities to make you question everything. But we haven't touched one of Rome's greatest loves: cheese. Cheese wasn't just food. In ancient Rome, it was a worldview. They had soft, hard, young, aged, and some so aggressive they'd be classified as biological hazards today. Romans loved cheese as snacks between meals, or, more honestly, between other questionable choices. One favorite was fried cheese patties, popular in taverns and snack shops. These were made from mashed, soft cheese. Think ricotta's ancient cousin, mixed with flour or semolina, shaped into discs, and fried in oil until golden. Sounds good, right? Guaz, eaten immediately. Wait 5 minutes, and you were chewing on something with the consistency of a sandal strap. Some were sweetened with honey, others loaded with herbs. Occasionally nuts or dried fruit made their way in, which sounded clever, but often tasted like trail mix crashed into dairy. And then there was aged Roman cheese. Not your mild cheddar, not your creamy brie. This was hard, pungent, unapologetically sharp, often described as fragrant, which is ancient shorthand for brace yourself. Some were aged until they were essentially salt blocks. Others were left in baskets under the sun, possibly doubling as pest deterrents. Snacks showed up everywhere. Rations for soldiers, offerings at festivals, even wrapped as Saturnalia gifts, because nothing says season-ass greetings like a dairy brick that could double as a weapon. They were filling, inexpensive, and impressively durable, assuming you didn't mind them fighting back. For all their quirks, Romans adored cheese snacks. They were comforting, portable, and only occasionally hostile. In short, the mozzarella sticks of antiquity, minus the mozzarella, minus the sticks. And if cheese was their comfort food, garum was their obsession. Rome's universal flavor booster, fermented fish sauce. Let's be honest, garum wasn't delicate. It wasn't refined, wasn't something you used sparingly. It was fish guts, packed in clay jars, drowned in salt, and left under the sun until nature declared the job done. The result? A brown, oily, salty, tangy liquid Romans splashed on anything edible. Bread with garum. Yes, nuts with garum, certainly. Fried cheese with a drizzle of garum. It's bold choice, but very Roman. And garum wasn't just about flavor, it had status. Different grades existed, from cheap blends for the masses to premium batches aged longer than gladiators' careers. Variations like Lacroix Men and Alec came stamped with proud labels, bragging about origins, purity, and questionable health benefits. Think of it as ancient, organic, artisanal soy sauces with more intestines. The smell of garum making was so vile, factories were banned from city centers. That's right, in a place where open sewage and dubious public baths were normal. Even Romans drew the line at garum fumes. But once bottled, it was treasure. Emperors hoarded it, cooks worshipped it. Citizens slathered it on nearly everything short of moving livestock. It was Rome's ultimate flavor, but man, its greatest olfactory crime. Did people truly like it? Apparently, yes. It was praised in poetry, preserved in recipes, even admired in letters. Was it overpowering? Absolutely. Was it magical with fried snacks? Your idea of magic is strong, fishy, and vaguely alarming, then? Yes. So when you picture Roman junk food, don't stop at cheese, patties, or fig cakes, okay? Imagine cheese patties and fig cakes absolutely drowning in fermented fish sauce, 'cause in Rome, that was the flavor of victory. Still hungry, craving something casual, crunchy, and easy to eat with one hand, while the other waved dramatically at senators. Enter Roman street nuts. Walk through any busy market, whether the Forum, the docks of Ostia, the tangled lanes of Saboriand. You catch the crackle and pop of nuts roasting over open coals. Not the cozy cinnamon-scented kind you're imagining. More like street smoke mixed with salted temptation. Choices included almonds, walnuts, hazelnuts, and pine nuts. The last so expensive that dropping them might cost you your wallet and your dignity. Most were roasted, salted, and sometimes dressed up with herbs or honey. Easy, addictive, and pocket-sized. Vendors sold them in little cones of recycled wax tablets, or papyrus scraps bonus entertainment if yours still had someone's grocery list or bad poetry on it. And Romans adored them. Philosophers crunched on nuts while contemplating death. Gladiators wolfed them down for energy. Partygoers tossed them into mouths and occasionally empery with mixed accuracy. Even emperors enjoyed them, though theirs came peeled, gilded, and delivered on silver trays by trembling servants. Some were candied, like almonds dipped in honey, the closest thing Rome had to peanut brittle, capable of either breaking your teeth or winning your heart, depending on freshness. Of course, there were hazards. Overdoing it, especially on the garum-dusted kind, could bring indigestion, social fallout, and dramatic updates to your will. But none of that stopped the Romans. Nuts were cheap, quick, and satisfying the empire's original vending machine. Drop a coin, grab a handful of salty joy. Now, picture this. You've partied like a senator. You've soaked in wine, bellowed bad songs at Saturnalia. Maybe kissed someone who turned out to be your cousin's cousin's slave. The morning after, your toga sideways, Your mouth tastes like fish sauce and regret, and you need salvation. But in Rome, salvation doesn't come as aspirin or black coffee. Instead, you get heroic remedies disguised as snacks in the faint hope that Jupiter still cares. First cure, wine-soaked bread. Guess again, because what better treatment for wine damage than more wine, now absorbed into a stale loaf, so dry it doubles as sandpaper. Or maybe you're offered a raw egg whisked into spiced wine known as Pasca ovata. Basically, an ancient protein shake without refrigeration, hygiene, or joy. Gulp it down while some old man swears it restores your humors. Still reeling, it's time for the Etruscan hangover platter. Olives, garlic, vinegar-soaked onions, and maybe a bite of pickled fish. It's nothing like salty brine and regret to blast the sinuses clear. Another favorite, fried cabbage with cumin and oil. Doctors hailed it as miraculous. Diners mostly swore at it. It's greasy, pungent, and not exactly confidence-inspiring. There were sweeter options, though. Figs with honey and vinegar, or dates soaked in wine and dusted with pepper. Sugary, hydrating, and strange enough to distract you from the pounding in your head. And if all else failed, you could go full gladiator. A fistful of barley, a raw onion, and a punch to the chest. Not science, just sheer confidence and shame. The Romans didn't even call it a hangover. They called it troubled in the head, which frankly is more honest. Their cures were inconsistent, but they believed in them with the same zeal they believed fried dormice were sophisticated. So, picture yourself hunched at a thermopolium counter, sipping spiced vinegar, chewing cabbage, okay, and praying to Bacchus for mercy. Welcome to recovery Roman style. But while Romans were nursing their hangovers across the sea, another story was brewing. Before he was Rome's nightmare, before elephants marched through snow-choked Alps, Hannibal Barca was just a boy. Wide-eyed, sharp-minded, and raised in the furnace of vengeance. It was around 237 BCE Carthage, once a dominant North African power, had just lost the First Punic War to Rome. No one felt that sting more than Hamilcar Barca, Hannibal's father. He wasn't just a commander, he was Carthage's pride, brilliant, fierce, and deeply humiliated by defeat. And he wasn't finished. When Hamilcar prepared to head for Iberia, modern Spain, to rebuild Carthaginian strength and carve out a new empire, he took his 9-year-old son with him. But this wasn't a family holiday, it was indoctrination. Legend says Hamilcar brought Hannibal to the Temple of Baal before departure, pressed the boy's hand to a blood-soaked altar, had him swear an oath never to be a friend to Rome, not tolerate, not ignore ever. Most children learned math and sword drills. Hannibal's education was war, politics, and vengeance. His classroom was a campaign tent. His father was both teacher and general. His textbook was revenge. As the army moved into Iberia, Hannibal absorbed everything. He saw his father win savage battles, cut deals with rival tribes, and slowly build a new base of power. He memorized every Roman envoy, every broken treaty, every Carthaginian casualty. By the time Hamilcar died and command passed to Hannibal's brother-in-law, Hasdrubal, the boy was already hardened. And when Hasdrubal was assassinated years later, Hannibal, now just 26, was chosen by the army itself to lead, not by the Senate, not by the elites, but by the soldiers who had grown up beside him, fought beside him, and trusted him. The oath of a child became the mission of a man. Rome had won the first round. But Hannibal Barca was about to rewrite everything they thought they knew about war. He wasted no time. As soon as he took command in Iberia, he unleashed a campaign of sheer ferocity. He began with the Spanish tribes, fractured, proud, endlessly feuding. Hannibal didn't just storm in with force. He negotiated, bribed, even married into alliances. Those who resisted, he crushed with clever ambushes and devastating traps. He staged battles like theater, allowing part of his force to feign retreat, then circling back to encircle the enemy once they took the bait. He played minds as masterfully as swords, and his men adored him. Hannibal marched beside them, ate their rations, bled in their battles. He wasn't a general on a gilded platform. He was one of them, and they would follow him anywhere. Rome, meanwhile, grew anxious. They had a treaty with Hasdrubal that Carthage wouldn't cross the Ebro River. But Hannibal wasn't interested in Roman's paperwork. He had a bigger vision. His first target, Saguntum, a Roman ally just south of the Ebro. Attacking Saguntum wasn't just bolded, it was practically announcing war. Hannibal besieged the city, starved it, battered its walls, and eventually stormed it. Survivors were either killed or sold into slavery. Rome's fears were confirmed. Hannibal wasn't bluffing, and he wasn't afraid. Outraged, the Senate demanded Carthage hand him over for violating the treaty. Spoiler: Carthage didn't. Carthage's reply: a collective shrug. The council argued, the nobles squabbled, but no one dared or cared enough to stop him. Hannibal had grown larger than Carthage itself. With Iberia firmly under his control and Rome seething across the waters, his sights now turned toward Italy. Not by ship, not by formal declaration, but by attempting the unthinkable. He would carry the war to Rome's doorstep on the backs of elephants. When Hannibal revealed his scheme to invade Italy by marching over the Alps, his commanders thought madness had consumed him. The Alps weren't merely mountains, they were death traps, snow-choked, perilous, crawling with hostile tribes. No rational leader would try it. Least of all, with tens of thousands of troops, pack animals, and a train of African war elephants. But Hannibal wasn't seeking reason. He sought terror and astonishment. In 218 BCE, he launched one of the boldest campaigns in military history. With roughly 50,000 soldiers and 37 elephants, Hannibal pushed north from Iberia, crossed the Pyrenees, fought skirmishes with Celtic tribes, and reached the Rhine River. There, in a feat bordering on lunacy, he loaded elephants onto rafts and ferried them across. Yes, elephants on rafts. Logistics were nightmarish. Rome never saw it coming. They had braced for an invasion by sea or along the coast, not from a warlord rewriting the playbook before even touching the Alps. The Alpine climb was sheer agony. Landslides swallowed gear, snow blinded men, freezing winds, starvation, and altitude sickness claimed thousands. Supplies dwindled, morale crumbled, and deserters fled. Elephants lost their footing and plunged into ravines. One account tells of soldiers hacking frozen hooves free from ice with picks. Yet Hannibal pressed on, pointing toward the fertile plains of Italy and promising spoils, farmland, and vengeance. He shattered ice with fire, weakened rock with vinegar, and drove his battered army forward with sheer will. After nearly 2 weeks of misery, fewer than half his troops stumbled out alive into the Po Valley, frostbitten, starving, and drained. But there, for Rome, it was a nightmare realized. No one had ever crossed the Alps with an army, let alone elephants. Hannibal's march was not just a feat of endurance, it was a declaration. Rome was vulnerable. Nowhere was safe. He had arrived, and he had no intention of retreating. Wasting no time, Hannibal recruited disgruntled Gallic tribes in northern Rome's bitter rivals, and they flocked to his side. Rome, shocked yet arrogant, scrambled to respond. Consul Gaius Flaminius, fueled by pride and determined to erase the humiliation of Hannibal's crossing, led his legions in pursuit. But Hannibal had already chosen the ground, and it was perfect for slaughter. The site was Lake Trasimene, a misty, confined valley bordered by water on one side and steep hills on the other, a natural killing field. Hannibal placed his infantry in plain view, baiting Flaminius forward. Cute by the dawn, fogged by the dawn fog, his cavalry and elite units lay in wait. On June 21st, 217 BCE, Flaminius charged in reckless, overconfident, blind to danger. The Romans marched straight into the trap. Then, at Hannibal's signal, his concealed troops poured down from the heights, slamming into the Roman flanks. Carthage's reaction, a collective shrug. The council argued, nobles quarreled, but no one dared or, perhaps, even wanted to rein him in. Hannibal had outgrown Carthage itself, with Iberia secured and Rome seething across the Mediterranean. His gaze shifted toward Italy. Not by ship, not through formal declarations, but by attempting the impossible. He would carry war directly to Rome using elephants. When Hannibal revealed his plan to cross the Alps instead of arriving by sea, his officers thought he'd gone mad. The Alps weren't just mountains, okay? They were frozen death traps, snowbound, treacherous, and filled with hostile tribes. No rational commander would attempt it, especially not with tens of thousands of troops, pack animals, and African war elephants. But Hannibal wasn't after reason. He wanted terror and spectacle. In 218 BCE, he launched one of the boldest campaigns in military history. With roughly 50,000 men and 37 elephants, Hannibal marched out of Iberia, crossed the Pyrenees, fought skirmishes with Celtic tribes, and reached the Rhine River. There, in an act of sheer madness, he ferried his elephants across on rafts. Rome had expected an invasion by sea or along coastal routes. Not this. Hannibal was rewriting the rules before he had even reached the Alps. The Alpine crossing was misery itself. Avalanches swallowed baggage. Snow blinded men. Bitter winds, hunger, and altitude sickness killed thousands. Morale collapsed. Deserters fled. Elephants slipped to their deaths in icy ravines. One tale describes soldiers hacking frozen hooves loose from rock with picks. But Hannibal pressed on, urging his men to picture the fertile plains of Italy, promising them spoils, farmland, and revenge. Fire shattered ice, vinegar cracked stone, and Hannibal's will dragged his army forward. After nearly 2 weeks of torment, fewer than half his men stumbled out alive into the Po Valley, exhausted, frostbitten, half-starved, but there. For Rome, it was a nightmare. No one had ever crossed the Alps with an army, let alone elephants. Hannibal's march wasn't just survival, it was a proclamation. Rome was vulnerable. Nowhere was safe. He had come, and he wasn't leaving. Once in Italy, Hannibal wasted no time. He rallied discontented Gallic tribes, Rome's enemies, and they flocked to him. Rome, stunned but arrogant, rushed to respond. Consul Gaius Flaminius, burning with pride, led his legions in pursuit, hoping for a quick victory. But Hannibal had already chosen the killing ground. Lake Trasimena, foggy, narrow valley boxed in by water and steep ridges was perfect for an ambush. Hannibal placed his infantry in view, baiting Flaminius forward, hidden in the hills, cloaked by morning mist. His cavalry and elite troops waited. Skate on June 21st, 217 BCE. Flaminius charged, overconfident and blind to danger. The Romans marched straight into the trap. Hannibal's men poured down from the heights, striking the flanks. His cavalry cut off retreat. The Roman line, stretched thin, had no room to maneuver. All soldiers, drowned in the lake, were trampled in flight or cut down where they stood. Flaminius himself was killed while trying to rally his men. In hours, 15,000 Romans lay dead, thousands more captured. Hannibal hadn't lost a single officer. The ambush at Trasimene became the largest and most devastating ambush in military history. Rome panicked, streets filled with screams and prayers. Mothers wept. The Senate, desperate, appointed a dictator, Quintus Fabius Maximus, to handle the crisis. But Hannibal wasn't done. He had crossed into their homeland, destroyed their legions, and now roamed Italy like a phantom, elusive and destructive. Rome still refused to negotiate. That suited Hannibal fine. He wanted humiliation, not peace. And his deadliest triumph still lay ahead. Trasimene was Hannibal's masterpiece of ambush. Cannae was his grand symphony of destruction. By 216 BCE, Rome abandoned caution. They raised the largest army in their history, around 80,000 men under consuls. Lucius, Aemilius, Paulus, and Gaius Terentius, Pharaoh twice, Hannibal's force. Their plan wasn't strategy. It was brute force. Smash him with sheer numbers. Hannibal knew it, and he grinned. He chose Cannae in southern Italy, a wide plain, perfect for cavalry maneuvers. His formation looked simple. His weaker Gauls and Spaniards formed a shallow bulge in the center. Strong African infantry held the flanks. His cavalry stretched even farther out on both wings. The stage was set. When battle began, the Roman column surged forward, hammering Hannibal's center. His line bent inward, collapsing slowly, but never broke. Romans pressed deeper and deeper into the pocket, convinced they were winning. Then the trap closed. Hannibal's African infantry swung in from the sides. His cavalry, having routed the Roman horse, circled back and struck from the rear. The Romans were surrounded on all sides. No escape, no space to fight, only suffocation in the summer heat. Packed so tightly, soldiers couldn't lift their swords. Panic set in. Hannibal's troops cut them down methodically. In one day, 50,000, 70,000 Romans were killed, more than the population of entire cities. It was Rome's worst defeat and remains one of history's bloodiest battles. But Hannibal didn't march on Rome, not because he couldn't, but because he knew the city would not fall easily. He needed reinforcements, siege engines, supplies. Carthage hesitated. Even after Rome's darkest day, Hannibal stood alone. His name alone terrified Rome. Mothers warned children with it. Hannibal is at the gates. And yet, strangely, he never entered the city. For 16 years, he haunted the Italian countryside, undefeated, unpredictable, but abandoned by his own people. Southern cities pledged loyalty. Allies fell into chaos, but Carthage held back. Its Senate distrusted him, feared his rising influence, and refused him the reinforcements needed to finish Rome off. Hannibal adapted, but his chance at ultimate victory slipped further away. He became a master of survival, fighting guerrilla-style skirmishes, harassing supply lines, destroying crops, and always staying just out of reach. The Romans under Fabius Maximus, nicknamed the Delayer, refused to give battle. They shadowed him, avoiding open conflict, starving him of opportunities. Hannibal still scored victories. He crushed Roman forces at Hardonia, ambushed them in Apulia, and even destroyed entire consular armies that dared to chase him. And he kept doing it without ever losing a major engagement. But time was turning against him. Rome, battered but relentless, adapted. They built more legions, trained new commanders, strengthened their alliances. While Hannibal wandered with a shrinking army, Rome expanded its power like a hydra growing new heads, and the war began to shift elsewhere. Rome invaded Iberia, cutting off Carthaginian supply lines. Hannibal's own brother, Hasdrubal, tried to bring reinforcements by crossing the Alps, just like Hannibal had years before. But Rome intercepted him, crushed his army, and threw Hasdrubal's severed head into Hannibal's camp. That message was clear. You're alone now. Hannibal's dream of breaking Rome from within was fading. He had turned Italy into a graveyard of legions. Without reinforcements, without siege engines, without political backing, he couldn't deliver the final blow. Still, he refused to leave. He had promised his father as a boy that he would be no friend to Rome, and he kept that promise every year he remained on their soil. But soon, Rome would come knocking, not in Italy, but on Carthage's own shores. And Hannibal would have no choice but to go home for the final fight. By 203 B.C., the tide had fully turned. Rome had clawed back from disaster, conquered Hannibal's strongholds in Iberia, and taken the fight directly to North Africa. Leading the charge was Scipio Africanes, a young, brilliant general who had studied Hannibal's tactics obsessively. Rome was no longer content to wait. They wanted Carthage destroyed, and to save itself, the Carthaginian Senate had to do the unthinkable. Tome. After 16 years of near-mythical campaigning in Italy, Hannibal left the land he had bled for. He returned to Carthage to defend a city that had abandoned him and to face a man trained in the art of Hannibalic warfare. The final showdown came at Zama in 202 BCE. This time, the armies were nearly evenly matched. Hannibal commanded a force of veterans, levies, and 80 war elephants. Scipio, meanwhile, had disciplined Roman legions and Numidian cavalry, crucially led by Massinissa, a former Carthaginian ally who had switched sides. Hannibal opened the battle with a massive elephant charge. It was meant to shatter the Roman lines, but Scipio had planned for this. He ordered his troops to part, creating corridors that funneled the elephants safely through. The beasts either panicked or passed harmlessly between the Roman ranks. Some even turned back, trampling Hannibal's own lines. What followed was a fierce infantry clash. Hannibal's veterans fought valiantly, even pushing back Rome's front lines. But when Scipio's cavalry returned from the flanks and attacked from behind, just as Hannibal had done at Cannae, the Carthaginian formation collapsed. The roles had reversed. Hannibal, once the master of encirclement, was now its victim. Carthage was forced to surrender. The terms were brutal. They had to give up their fleet, pay a massive indemnity, and promise never to wage war without Rome's permission. Hannibal had lost. But it wasn't just a military defeat. It was the death of a vision. His lifelong mission to break Rome's grip on the Mediterranean was shattered in the North African dust. Yet even in defeat, Rome didn't kill him. They feared him too much to make him a martyr. Instead, they let him live, knowing full well they hadn't seen the last of him, because Hannibal Barca wasn't done making history. Not yet. Hannibal returned to Carthage, not as a defeated general, but as a survivor. While Zama had broken Carthage militarily, Hannibal still commanded immense respect. The people saw him not as the man who lost the war, but as the man who nearly won it against impossible odds. So what did Hannibal do? He reinvented himself. He became a politician. Yes, the man who had once commanded elephants through the Alps now sat in the Carthaginian Senate, rooting out corruption, reforming finances, and trying to repair the shattered state. He slashed taxes, paid off debts, and revitalized Carthage's economy, quickly gaining a reputation as a brilliant, if unpopular, reformer. But Rome wasn't watching from the sidelines. They feared Hannibal's mind more than his sword. A strong Carthage, even a peaceful one, was a threat if Hannibal was at the helm. So Rome accused him falsely of conspiring with enemy states. Cornered once again, Hannibal fled. Thus began his second life, the life of a hunted exile. He wandered from court to court, offering his military genius to foreign kings. First to Antiochus III of the Seleucid Empire, Rome's newest rival. Hannibal tried to rally them for another great war, but Antiochus ignored much of his advice and lost spectacularly. Rome's influence only grew. After Antiochus' defeat, Hannibal kept running. He became a ghost, drifting through Asia Minor, pursued constantly by Roman envoys who demanded his surrender at every port. And yet, wherever he went, he left whispers, stories, fear. The name Hannibal still sent chills down Roman spines. Despite his defeats, he remained a symbol of defiance, a one-man rebellion against imperial arrogance. He couldn't raise new armies. He had no homeland, no power, just a brilliant mind, a long shadow, and enemies who never stopped watching him. By now, he was in his 60s, gray-haired, worn thin by decades of war and exile. Even then, Hannibal remained sharper than most living generals. In Rome, still wasn't satisfied. They wanted him erased, not just from politics or the battlefield, but from the story. So they came for him one final time, and Hannibal, true to character, would not let them have the satisfaction. By the early 180s BCE, Hannibal had become a living legend and a liability, not just to Rome, but to every kingdom that dared to shelter him. He was now hiding in Bithynia, a small kingdom in Asia Minor, ruled by King Prasius the First Thirst. Hannibal, ever the strategist, helped the king win a naval battle using a trick straight out of his playbook. Catapults loaded with clay jars filled with venomous snakes, launched onto enemy ships to sow chaos and fear. Even in his final years, his mind was still 2 moves ahead. But Rome didn't care about snake jars. They wanted Hannibal gone forever. They pressured Puses, sent emissaries, and made threats. Eventually, word reached Hannibal that his sanctuary had been betrayed. Roman agents were closing in on the villa where he was hiding. He didn't run this time. According to legend, Hannibal had long kept a vial of poison hidden in a ring carried with him as insurance. If Rome ever cornered him like an animal, he would go out on his own terms. Now the moment had come. He reportedly wrote a short message before taking the poison. Let us relieve the Romans from their long anxiety, since they think it too tedious a task to wait for an old man's death. Just like that, it was over. Hannibal Barca, Rome's greatest nightmare, died not on a battlefield, but in a foreign land, hunted, exiled, and alone. And yet, even in death, Rome couldn't bury him. They destroyed his city, razed Carthage decades later in the Third Punic War, and salted its earth. But they never forgot him. Centuries later, Roman historians, men who should have hated him, wrote about his brilliance with awe. He had led from the front, fought against overwhelming odds, and outwitted every Roman general sent to kill him. He crossed the Alps with elephants, devastated Italy for years, and gave the greatest military machine in history a fear it would never shake. And he did it all while staying true to one thing, his boyhood oath, to never be a friend to Rome. Even in exile, even in death, Hannibal won a different kind of war, the war for legacy. And in that war, he remains undefeated. Every autumn in ancient Greece, a strange transformation would grip the land between Athens and the small town of Eleusis. Roads filled with chanting pilgrims, smoke and incense drifted through the hills. And somewhere in the darkness, under torchlight and secrecy, something sacred and forbidden took place. This was the Eleusinian Mysteries, the most famous and mysterious religious festival of the ancient world. It wasn't just a celebration, it was a spiritual initiation. And unlike the rowdy Dionysian orgies or the public pomp of Olympic festivals, this one came with rules, ironclad rules. Break the silence, speak of what happened inside the sacred hall, and you could be executed. The core of the festival centered around Didida, the goddess of the harvest, and her daughter Persephone. According to myth, Persephone was kidnapped by Hades, god of the underworld. Dida, devastated, caused the world's crops to wither in mourning. Eventually, a deal was struck. Persephone would spend part of the year underground and part above. This myth became a powerful metaphor for the agricultural cycle, death and rebirth, decay and renewal. But the mysteries weren't just agricultural, they were cosmic. To the Greeks, this wasn't just about farming, it was about the fate of the soul. Participants known as May underwent a multi-day journey. They fasted, they bathed in the sea, they carried sacred objects, and then at Eleusis, they entered the Telesterion, a great hall where the innermost rites took place. What exactly they saw or experienced inside is still debated. Some think it involved a symbolic reenactment of Persephone's return. Others believe it was a visionary experience, perhaps aided by a hallucinogenic potion called Kikon. Whatever it was, it left people changed. From emperors like Hadrian to philosophers like Plato, many of the greatest minds of antiquity went through the Eleusinian Mysteries and emerged, convinced that death was not the end. This was religion, not as obedience, but as transformation, a sacred encounter with the cycles of life, loss, and renewal. And for over 1,000 years, The Elohinian mysteries endured longer than most empires, until one day Christianity rose. The old gods were outlawed, and the secrets of Elis were buried forever. No one ever broke the vow of silence. And so, the mystery lives on. While Greece cloaked its sacred rites in mystery, ancient Egypt preferred something far more spectacular. Public religion on parade and no festival embodied this more than the Opet festival held annually in the grand city of Thebes. The Opet festival was one of the most magnificent religious events in ancient Egypt. Its purpose to rejuvenate the pharaoh's divine essence and reaffirm his sacred bond with the gods, especially Amun-Ra, the chief deity of Thebes. It began at the colossal temple of Karnak, home to the mighty god Ammon, his wife Mut, and their son Khonsu, the Theban triad. Priests carried their sacred statues, sealed within golden shrines, onto ceremonial boats called barks. These weren't ordinary boats, okay? They were massive, gilded, and often carried on the shoulders of dozens of priests through the streets. Later, they were floated down the Nile itself. The destination, the Luxor Temple, about 2 kilometers away, linked to Kerak by a grand avenue lined with hundreds of sphinx. The journey between the temples was not silent or solemn. It was vibrant, theatrical, and drenched in pageantry. Dancers, musicians, acrobats, and chanting priests filled the streets. Commoners came out in droves, not just to watch, but to participate. For many Egyptians, this was their chance to see the divine, not hidden in the inner sanctums of a temple, but paraded openly, proudly, and dazzlingly through the city. And this wasn't just ritual for show. The pharaoh himself joined the procession, often taking part in sacred reenactments. In some eras, it was believed the god Amen merged spiritually with the pharaoh during the ceremony, recharging his divine mandate to rule. It was a renewal of power, not through conquest, but through cosmic approval. There was also a deeply human element. During the festival, the strict boundaries between priest and peasant, god and mortal, loosened. As people feasted, drank, danced. It was joy wrapped in divinity. A moment when heaven touched earth, however briefly. The Opet festival lasted anywhere from 11 to 27 days, depending on the period and the pharaoh's budget. And, while each celebration had its own flavor, the message remained the same. Egypt was in balance, the gods were pleased, and the divine order of Maat still reigned. For the Egyptians, that meant everything. The Eleusinian mysteries were about divine secrets, and the Opet festival about royal divinity. Then Saturnalia was something else entirely. A week-long party where Rome gleefully abandoned its rules, held every December in honor of Saturn, the Roman god of agriculture, time, and liberation. Saturnalia was a deeply rooted festival, celebrating the end of the harvest and a nostalgic longing for the mythical Golden Age, a time when Saturn ruled and all men were free and equal. And for a few chaotic days, Romans tried to relive that dream. It began with a sacrifice at the Temple of Saturn in the Forum, followed by a public feast. Then all social norms were flipped on their heads. Stirs served their slaves. Senators wore colorful tunics instead of togas. Gambling, usually banned, was openly permitted. Work stopped. Schools closed. The courts shut down. Rome didn't function, at least not in the usual sense. One of the festival's most bizarre traditions was the election of a Saturnalian king, sometimes called the Lord of Misrule. This was often a lower-ranking citizen, a slave, or even a child, given mock authority to issue absurd commands. Sing naked in the streets, balance a plate on your head. Obeying these ridiculous orders was part of the fun. Saturnalia was also when people exchanged gifts, wax candles, small figurines, and even poetry. It was lighthearted, full of laughter, and had a warmth that feels oddly familiar. In fact, many scholars argue that Saturnalia is one of the cultural ancestors of Christmas. The timing, the gift-giving, the candles, the feasting, it all echoes through time. But Saturnia wasn't just a holiday. It was a pressure valve, cool, for a society so rigidly structured, with slaves at the bottom and senators at the top. It allowed for the illusion, however brief, that everyone was equal. That maybe, just maybe, there could be a return to Saturn's mythical golden age. Of course, when the festival ended, everything snapped back into place. Slaves returned to servitude. The Senate resumed its bickering. The streets quieted. But for that week of reversal, Rome became a theater of joy, chaos, and shared humanity. Because even an empire needs a break from pretending it has everything under control. Long before alarm clocks and New Year countdowns, ancient Persians were already celebrating a festival of rebirth, balance, and fire. One that still survives today. Novus, the Persian New Year, rooted in Zoroastrianism, one of the world's oldest monotheistic religions. Novus wasn't just about turning a calendar page. It marked the spring equinox, a moment when day and night are perfectly balanced. To Zoroastrians, this balance reflected the eternal struggle between Ahura Mazda, the force of light and order, and Angra Mainyu, darkness and chaos. Tino, a symbolized victory of light over dark, of cleanliness over corruption, and hope over despair. Preparation began weeks in advance. Homes were swept, walls washed, debts settled. This wasn't just spring cleaning, it was a spiritual purge. Everything dirty or chaotic had to go. Bars were lit in courtyards and along city walls. On the eve of the new year, people would leap over flames, shouting, "Give me your red color. Take away my sickness." The fire, sacred in Zoroastrian belief, wasn't just heat and light. It was purification. Then came the halves table, an altar-like arrangement of 7 symbolic items, beginning with the Persian letter S, sabz, sprouted greens for growth, say, garlic for protection, send, dried fruit for love, sear vinegar for wisdom, and more. Each item represented a moral or cosmic value. Temples, called fire temples, held special ceremonies during this period. Zoroastrian priests in white robes chanted hymns from the Avesta, their holy texts, and offered fragrant woods to the ever-burning sacred flame. For believers, it was a time to reflect, to realign with truth, usher, and to embrace the turning of the cosmic wheel. But no rule wasn't just solemn. It was joyous. Families gathered, tables overflowed with food, children received gifts, and musicians filled streets with drums and flutes. For a society that prized cosmic order, this was a moment when everything reset. Not just the year, but the soul. Nous outlived empires, was celebrated by the Achaemenids, the Parthians, the Sassanids, and it continues today across Iran, Central Asia, and beyond. Few ancient religious festivals have endured this long. But then again, few were built so elegantly around something as universal and eternal as light returning to the world. In ancient Athens, worship didn't always mean incense and silence. Sometimes it meant masks, wine, and a god who knew how to throw a party. Dionysus, god of wine, fertility, theater, and sacred madness. And no festival captured his chaotic brilliance like the Great Dionysia held every spring. This festival wasn't some fringe cult celebration. This was one of the most important public events in the Athenian calendar. It honored Dionysus not through animal sacrifice or solemn chants, but through drama, tragedy, and comedy performed in his name. It began with a procession through the city. Citizens carried giant phallic symbols. Yes, really, with ivor-covered staffs and chanted hymns as they led a statue of Dionysus to the Theater of Dionysus at the foot of the Acropolis. There were flutes, dancers, and a tidal wave of wine-fueled enthusiasm. Then came the performances. Over several days, playwrights competed in a sacred contest, presenting 3 tragedies and 1 satyr play each. These weren't casual shows. Were state-sponsored events. judged by elite citizens and watched by up to 15,000 people at a time. Attendance was civic duty. Even prisoners could be released on bail to attend. The themes: gods, fate, hubris, revenge, war, and suffering. Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides. These masters told stories that ripped the soul open. Imagine watching Oedipus discover he married his mother with your neighbors beside you, gasping in horror. It wasn't just entertainment. It was ritual catharsis, okay? And after the tragedies came the comedies, raunchy, political, and often absurd. Aristophanes used them to mock politicians, question war, and skewer society itself. Nothing was off limits. But at its core, Dionysia was about more than theater. Tia, it was about stepping out of yourself, about breaking down the masks society forces us to wear, and putting on literal ones to explore truths we couldn't otherwise say aloud. It was madness with meaning. Dionysus wasn't a calm, orderly god. He was wild, untamed, a bridge between civilization and its primal roots. The Dionysia gave space for that side of humanity to breathe, shout, laugh, and grieve. For the Athenians, this wasn't escape. This was religion. A mirror held up to the soul with a wine cup in hand, and the god of ecstatic transformation watching from the wings. Among ancient religious festivals, few are as raucous, theatrical, okay, and subversively spiritual as Purim, a Jewish holiday that's part survival story, part political satire, and all about divine irony. Purim commemorates the events told in the book of Esther set in the Persian Empire under King Ahasuerus, likely Xerxes II. The plot sounds almost like a drama from the great Dionysia. A Jewish girl named Esther becomes queen, hides her identity, and eventually risks her life to stop a genocidal plot by the king's advisor, Haman, to annihilate the Jews. She succeeds. Haman is hanged on his own gallows, and the Jewish people are saved. It's a story about reversal of fate, the hidden workings of providence, and the power of courage. But unlike solemn religious festivals, Purim is pure, unfiltered joy, a celebration of survival that leans into laughter and liberation. The festival begins with a public reading of the Megillah Book of Esther, often performed like a comedic play. Every time Haman's name is mentioned, the crowd drowns it out with graggers, noisemakers, booze, and shouting. Children dress up as Esther, Moray, or even Haman. Costumes and chaos are encouraged. Then come the commandments of celebration, feasting, with lavish meals, gifting food to friends, giving to the poor, and most famously drinking until you can't distinguish between blessed is Mordeh and cursed is Haman. Yes, that's actually written in the Talmud. Behind the festivity lies something profound. Unlike other Jewish holidays, God is never mentioned by name in the book of Esther. Not once. It's the only book in the Hebrew Bible with that distinction. This absence forces readers to look for hidden divine intervention, a lesson in faith without direct revelation. Purim teaches that even when miracles don't look like parted seas or fire from heaven, they can still unfold behind palace doors through courage, risk, and unlikely heroes. So people celebrate with parody, masks, satire, and storytelling. They laugh in the face of death. They mock the villain. And in doing so, they affirm something deeply spiritual. Survival is sacred, and joy is resistance. In the misty hills and forested valleys of ancient Ireland, the beginning of August marked a sacred and deeply communal event. Lughnasadh, pronounced Lunasar, the Celtic festival honoring Lugh, the god of light, craftsmanship, and war. Unlike the grand temple festivals of Rome or Egypt, Lughnasadh was celebrated outdoors, on hilltops, in fields, and by sacred wells. It wasn't about imperial spectacle. It was about the land, the harvest, and the fragile bargain between humans and nature. Lugh, the namesake of the festival, was a solar deity, a shining warrior and master of all arts. But Lughnasadh wasn't just about worshipping him directly. According to myth, Lug held the first festival to honor his foster mother, Tile II, who died from exhaustion after clearing the plains of Ireland to make way for farmland. In her honor, people gathered to give thanks for the first grain harvest, and two, in the heart of the Indian subcontinent, as winter melts into spring, an explosion of color, music, and fire erupts across villages, towns, and cities. It's loud, it's wild, it's sacred, says Holi, one of the most joyful and symbolic festivals in ancient Hindu tradition. It's known today for its clouds of colored powder and water fights. Holi has deep religious and mythological roots. Bhuj, at its core, it celebrates the victory of good over evil, the arrival of spring and the burning away of the old to make room for renewal. The festival begins the night before the color with Halakika Dahan, the ceremonial bonfire. Its origins lie in the myth of Prada, a devout follower of the god Vishnu and his demon father, Hiranyakashipu, who demanded to be worshipped instead. When Prahlada refused, his father conspired to kill him by placing him on the lap of his sister Holika, who was immune to fire. But divine justice had other plans. Kika burned and Prada emerged unharmed. Every year, Holika's effigy is burned in bonfires across India. The fire symbolizes the destruction of ego, hatred, and evil, and the cleansing of the soul through light and heat. And then comes the color. The next morning, the streets transform into a living kaleidoscope. People throw guli, vibrant colored powders, at each other, drench friends with colored water, and dance to drums and flutes. It's impossible to stay clean or somber, but this chaos is ritual chaos. Social boundaries collapse, rich and poor, old and young, men and women all become equals under layers of red, green, blue, and yellow. Enemies reconcile, strangers become companions. For one day, the world becomes unrecognizable, and beautifully so. Holi also connects to the legend of Krishna and Radha, where Krishna, self-conscious about his dark skin, playfully smeared color on Radha's fair face. Their divine romance became an eternal metaphor for playful love and divine unity. That's why Holi isn't just fire and purification, it's flirtation, joy, and affection. Underneath the celebration is a spiritual message, the cycle of seasons, the resilience of the soul, and the beauty in embracing impermanence. Because after the flames die down and the colors fade from your skin, what remains is a lesson Holi was always trying to teach. Light returns. Joy is sacred, and rebirth is always just around the corner. Amid the thunder of Roman armies and the pomp of imperial parades, there existed a ritual so secret, so exclusive, that even Rome's most powerful men were banned from attending. No senators, no priests, no emperors, only women. This was the festival of Benadia, the good goddess, held each December at the home of Rome's highest magistrate. The festival was both religious and mysterious. It honored a goddess associated with fertility, healing, chastity, and the earth. But her exact origins and functions remain elusive, and that's by design. Everything about Benadia was cloaked in feminine secrecy. The rites were conducted by the Vestal, virgins, Rome's most sacred priestesses, and attended only by elite Roman women. Men were strictly forbidden, not just from participating, but even from knowing the rituals. In fact, not even male historians knew what happened during the ceremony. What we do know comes from scandal. In 62 BCE, the festival exploded into public controversy. That year, Julius Caesar, then Pontifex Maximus, was hosting the rites in his home as required, even though he couldn't attend. But his wife, Pompeia, was in charge of hosting the female-only celebration. Things took a turn when a reckless aristocrat named Publius Claius Pulcher disguised himself as a woman and sneaked into the ceremony, allegedly to seduce Pompeia. He was caught. A trial followed, turning a private sacred ritual into a public spectacle. Although Claius was acquitted, likely through bribery, Caesar divorced Pompeia famously declaring that Caesar's wife must be above suspicion. But beyond scandal, the Bonadia festival reveals something rare. It's a sacred space entirely controlled by women with their concerns, fertility, health, family. The rhythms of the body were placed at the center of religious life. It was a moment when Rome's rigid patriarchy stepped aside and the divine feminine reigned in secret. Wreaths of myrtle were banned, a symbol of Venus and possibly sexual love. Wine was disguised as milk. Music, incense, and offerings were made, perhaps even symbolic fertility rites. But no man ever saw them. No man ever would. And maybe that's the point. In a world that documented everything, the most powerful rituals were the ones no one wrote down. Because sometimes the sacred must remain unseen, protected by silence, and passed down only through whispered memory, long before it became a medieval obsession with turning lead into gold. Alchemy began in the temples and tombs of ancient Egypt. But in Egypt, it wasn't called alchemy. It was known as Kemia, meaning the black art, a reference not to anything sinister, but to the rich, dark soil of the Nile Valley known as Kemet, the Black Land. To the Egyptians, transformation wasn't just physical, it was sacred. It applied not only to matter, but to the soul. The ancient Egyptians were already masters of practical chemistry. They produced cosmetics, perfumes, glass, dyes, and metal alloys. They practiced advanced techniques in embalming, using resins, salts, and linen to preserve the body for eternity. But these weren't just medical procedures. These were rituals of transformation performed with divine intent. Every act of mummification, every pigment ground into paint was part of a cosmic process, the preparation of the body and soul for rebirth in the afterlife. In fact, death itself was seen as a kind of alchemical operation. Just as metals could be purified in fire, the soul of the dead had to be refined through trials in the underworld. The Book of the Dead, full of spells and incantations, acted like a guide for this spiritual transmutation. Central to Egyptian thought was the figure of Th, the Ibissetic god of wisdom, writing, and sacred knowledge. Later, when Greek and Egyptian cultures fused during the Ptolemaic period, Th was identified with the Greek god Hermes, creating the mythical sage Hermes Trismegistus, thrice great Hermes. He would become the legendary author of the Hermetic texts, mystical writings that laid the foundation for alchemy as a spiritual science. These texts spoke not just of material processes, but of divine unity, of the correspondence between the macrocosm and microcosm. As above, so below. In Egyptian alchemy, the transformation of matter was symbolic of the transformation of the soul. Turning base metals into gold was just a metaphor for turning an imperfect self into a purified being. So, when later alchemists in Greece and Europe searched for the philosopher's stone or eternal life, they were really carrying forward an ancient Egyptian idea. That true transformation doesn't begin in the lab, it begins in the heart. While Egypt gave alchemy its ritual soul, ancient Persia gave it a moral spine, a cosmic framework rooted in the eternal struggle between light and darkness. In the heart of the Persian Empire, long before medieval laboratories, the teachings of Zoroaster, shaped a worldview where transformation was not only desirable, it was necessary. His dualistic vision split the universe into two opposing forces, Ahura Mazda, the god of light, truth, and order, and Angra Manu, the spirit of darkness and chaos. Damale, this wasn't just myth, it was metaphysics, and it deeply influenced alchemical thinking. Zoroastrians worshipped through fire, a living symbol of truth and divine illumination. In temples, sacred flames were never allowed to die. Fire, purified, revealed, and transformed. Just like the alchemists' furnace centuries later, Persians also developed advanced metalwork techniques. They were among the first to refine copper, silver, and gold to smelt iron and to experiment with alloys. Their artisans weren't just craftsmen. They were seen as initiates in a process of perfecting nature. Smelting or into shining metal was viewed as an act of cosmic alignment, elevating raw, chaotic matter into something orderly and pure. Even the earliest Persian medicinal texts show traces of protochemical ideas, lists of minerals, metals, plants, and their effects on the human body. They didn't just want to heal the body, okay? They wanted to align it with the divine harmony of the universe. Later, Islamic scholars would preserve and expand on Persian alchemical ideas. How? But even in pre-Islamic times, we see the emergence of a powerful theme that would echo through alchemical traditions from Arabia to Europe. That matter is not static, and that within every impure substance lies the seed of perfection. It's the same idea that would later inspire alchemists to transmute lead into gold, or the soul from base to divine. Persian thought then offered a moral alchemy, purification, not just of elements, but of intention. Fire didn't simply melt metals, it burned away falsehood and revealed what was hidden. And in that hidden core, somewhere between smoke and spirit, Persian alchemists believed lay the divine spark that could change anything, even the self. If Egypt gave alchemy its sacred rites, and Persia its moral framework, it was ancient Greece that tried to explain it all with logic, geometry, and a touch of cosmic arrogance. Here, alchemy didn't vanish, it evolved. Greek thinkers took the mystical and chemical traditions of older civilizations and tried to make them make sense. But instead of crucibles and powders, they reached for philosophy. At the heart of Greek alchemical thought was the theory of four elements: earth, water, air, and fire. First proposed by Empedocles, these weren't just physical substances. They were fundamental principles of the universe, the Lego blocks of reality. Change, according to this view, was simply the rearrangement of these elements. Fire could become air. Water could become earth, and all things were in a constant dance of transformation. Later, philosophers like Plato added layers of meaning. He described matter as composed of perfect geometrical forms, tiny, invisible solids. In this version, alchemy became a quest not just for chemical reactions, but for harmony with the ideal world. Then came Aristotle, who altered everything. He proposed that all matter had four essential qualities: hot, cold, wet, and dry. By changing these qualities, you could change the substance itself. Lead was dry and heavy. Gold was balanced and radiant. So, if you could shift lead's properties, make it more noble, it could, in theory, become gold. Sound familiar? 8. This idea of transmutation, changing one substance into another, became the cornerstone of all later alchemy. But the Greeks didn't stop at theory, okay? In Hellenistic Alexandria, a melting pot of Egyptian mysticism, Greek philosophy, and Babylonian astronomy, alchemy as a practice finally began to take shape. Here, scholars and mystics recorded early recipes for dyes, perfumes, and metal alloys, but always wrapped in symbolic language. And it's here that the mythic figure of Hermes Trismegistus emerged, part Egyptian Thoth, part Greek Hermes, credited with writing the Hermetic Corpus. These texts spoke of purifying, not just matter, but the soul, urging practitioners to seek divine union through inner transformation. To the Greeks, alchemy wasn't about making money, it was about understanding nature, mirroring the cosmos, and perfecting the self through the hidden laws of reality. And that made it not just science, but something dangerously close to divine power. In the bustling port city of Alexandria, alchemy found its true laboratory, not just of matter, but of ideas. Founded by Alexander the Great and ruled by the Ptolemies, Alexandria was where Greek rationalism, Egyptian ritual, Babylonian astrology, and Persian metaphysics collided in a swirling intellectual stew. At its heart was the Great Library of Alexandria, a beacon of ancient knowledge were scrolls and scholars gathered from across the known world. Alchemy in this environment didn't just survive, it thrived. It was here that alchemy became both spiritual and practical, mystical and experimental. Egyptian temple rites merged with Greek natural philosophy. Babylonian star charts were studied alongside Greek medicine and Egyptian metallurgy. The result, a new kind of knowledge, half science, half sacrament. One of the earliest and most mysterious figures of Alexandrian alchemy was Mary the Jew's. She's credited with inventing some of the first alchemical apparatus, the Banamir, a double boiler still used in kitchens today, the Tripicos, a distillation device, and a system of vapor purification. Her work suggests that alchemists weren't just theorizing, they were conducting real chemical experiments. Another key figure was Zosimos of Panopolis, a 3rd, 4th century CE alchemist who left behind some of the earliest known writings on alchemy in Greek. But Zosimos didn't see alchemy as just physical. He wrote of dreams, visions, and spiritual purification. For him, turning lead into gold was a metaphor for turning the corrupted human soul into something divine. He described the alchemical vessel not just as a container for substances, but as a symbol of the body, the fire, the soul's inner torment, the vapor, the divine essence rising. His writings blurred the line between chemistry and mysticism, matter and metaphor. Alexandrian alchemists also leaned heavily on Hermeticism, the teachings of Hermes Trismegistus. As above, so below, they wrote. The microcosm reflects the macrocosm. Purify one, and you touch the other. In Alexandria, alchemy was no longer just about materials, it was about reality itself. It asked not just what things were made of, but why they could change, and whether the soul could be transformed alongside matter. Alchemy had become a mirror of the cosmos and of ourselves. And it was only just getting started when the great library of Alexandria fell into ruin and Europe slipped into the early Middle Ages. It was the Islamic world that became the new guardian of alchemical knowledge. From the 8th to the 13th centuries, under the Abbasid Caliphate, the Islamic Golden Age turned cities like Baghdad, Cairo, and Cordoba into centers of scientific and philosophical inquiry. Greek, Persian, and Indian texts were translated into Arabic at record pace, and among them were the foundational writings of alchemy. But here's the twist. Islamic scholars didn't just preserve ancient alchemy, they transformed it into Jabir ibn Hayyan, known in the West as GBA, a polymath working in 8th century Kufr. He's often called the father of chemistry. Jabir's writings, which numbered in the hundreds, blended Greek elemental theory, Persian mysticism, and Quranic cosmology into a structured science. He introduced a systematic approach to experimentation. He believed all metals were composed of sulfur and mercury, not in the literal sense, but as principles. Sulfur representing combustion and change, mercury standing for liquidity and volatility. According to Jabir, if you could balance these two forces, you could transmute one metal into another. He also introduced techniques still recognizable today: distillation, crystallization, sublimation, filtration, and calcination. His apparatuses became the blueprint for medieval laboratories. But Islamic alchemy wasn't just technical. It retained the spiritual heart of earlier traditions. Alchemy was seen as a path to divine understanding. Its transforming matter was a metaphor for purifying the soul, aligning with God's order in the universe. Later, alchemists like Al-Razi, Razis, and Avicenna, Ibn debated alchemy's legitimacy. Al-Razi supported it, emphasizing its practical medical applications. Avicenna, on the other hand, criticized the idea of transmutation, but respected the discipline's philosophical and ethical aims. Even in disagreement, they elevated alchemy into something more than a secretive craft. It became proto-chemistry, metaphysics, spiritual, discipline, and moral philosophy, Al-Anon. European scholars would later rediscover these Arabic texts, translating them into Latin and reviving alchemy in the West. But the soul of that alchemy, the belief that matter and spirit mirrored each other, was preserved, clarified, and systematized by Muslim scholars. And in their hands, alchemy stopped being legend and started becoming science. When the translated works of Arabic alchemists like Jabir, Ibn Ayon, El-Razi, and Avisa flowed into Europe during the 12th century, something remarkable happened. A revival of alchemy, this time under the shadowed stone towers of medieval monasteries and universities. Europe had been in intellectual hibernation. But with the rise of translation schools in places like Toledo and Sicily, Latin scholars gained access to a treasure trove of forgotten wisdom. Among these were the alchemical writings riddled with strange symbols, mysterious ingredients, and promises of transformation. The Europeans were hooked. To them, alchemy offered more than gold. It offered knowledge, power, and even immortality. The elusive philosopher's stone became the holy grail, said to transmute base metals into gold and bestow eternal life. But it wasn't just a material object. It symbolized the perfection of both matter and spirit. Medieval alchemists took this dual nature seriously. Figures like Albertus Magnus and Roger Bacon were both friars and experimental scientists. They believed that God had encoded the secrets of creation into the natural world, and that alchemy was a way to read that divine script. For them, alchemy wasn't sorcery. It was Christian natural philosophy, a means to understand the divine order through the transformation of substances. Laboratories became monastic floors of fire and glass, torches, Olympics, crucibles, and furnaces filled with substances like sulfur, mercury, antimony, and lead. Experiments were recorded in coded texts full of allegory and metaphor, a tradition that made alchemy seem arcane and impenetrable. But beneath the symbolism, serious work was being done. One of the most influential figures of this period was Pseudo-Geber, a mysterious Latin writer who adapted Arabic works into European forms. His books became standard references for later alchemists. Another key name was Arnold of Villanova, who blurred the lines between medicine and alchemy, focusing on creating elixirs that could heal and rejuvenate the body. For all its secrecy, medieval alchemy wasn't underground. It was debated in universities, sponsored by princes, and practiced by priests. Yet, despite its spiritual ambitions, many still chased the gold, sometimes literally, sometimes metaphorically. So, medieval Europe kept the flame of transformation burning. 1 part faith, 1 part fire, and 1 part philosophical dream. As Europe emerged from the medieval era into the Renaissance, alchemy didn't fade. It morphed, became more secretive, more symbolic, and strangely more mystical. Out of this fusion of Hermetic philosophy, Christian mysticism, and Renaissance humanism emerged one of the most curious movements in alchemical history, the Rosicrucians. In the early 1600s, anonymous manifestos began circulating across Europe. Farmer Fraternitatis, Confessio Fraternitatis, and The Chemical Wedding of Christian Rosenkreuz. These texts told the story of a hidden brotherhood, the Fraternity of the Rosy Cross, founded by a mythical figure named Christian Rosinets, who had journeyed through the East, learning secret wisdom before returning to Europe to quietly guide spiritual seekers. But here's the twist. There's no evidence the Rosicrucians existed as an actual organization, at least not at first. They were an idea, a symbol, and their influence was profound. Rosicrucian alchemy was not about making gold. It was about enlightenment. It combined alchemical transformation with Christian esotericism, seeing the purification of metals as a metaphor for the purification of the soul. The Philosopher's Stone became a symbol for Christ's consciousness, inner rebirth, and union with the divine. Their manifestos promised a reformation of science, religion, and politics, a secret spiritual revolution that would lead humanity into a new golden age. but they offered no addresses, no names, no leaders, just symbols: the rose, secrecy and beauty, and the cross, sacrifice and transformation. This was alchemy, a spiritual allegory, rich in metaphor, full of veiled references. The Rosicrucians believed that truth was hidden, not because it was forbidden, but because it had to be earned through personal transformation. Their ideas influenced scientists, mystics, artists, and poets. Isaac Newton owned Rosicrucian texts. Johann Valentine, Andrea, thought to be the author of The Chemical Wedding, saw the story as allegory, yet it spread like wildfire through occult circles. By now, alchemy had become layered with meaning. To some, it was still about materials. To others, it was pure metaphor. To the Rosicrucians, it was a spiritual path hidden in plain sight. And though their brotherhood may have been mythical, their influence was very real, whispering through the centuries that the true gold is within. As the 17th century unfolded, alchemy began rubbing shoulders with something unexpected: modern science. But it wasn't a clean break. The line between alchemist and chemist was blurred. Theriault and many of the figures who built the scientific method were paradoxically still chasing the philosopher's stone. One of the most famous examples, Isaac Newton. Yes, the same man who formulated the laws of motion and gravitation spent more time in his life studying alchemy than physics. In secret, Newton filled notebooks with arcane experiments, analyzing ancient symbols and attempting to uncover the divine mechanics of the universe. To him, the cosmos was a divine machine, and alchemy was a language written in fire and gold. To understand it, Newton wasn't alone. Robert Boyle, often called the father of modern chemistry, was also steeped in alchemical thought. His famous 1661 book, The Skeptical Chemist, challenged the classical for element theory and laid the groundwork for chemical analysis. But Boyle also believed in the transmutation of metals and saw alchemy as a valid field of inquiry. So, what changed? The key difference was methodology. Alchemy had long been shrouded in symbolism, secrecy, and spiritual metaphor, but emerging scientists began demanding clarity, repeatability, and evidence. They started shedding the mystical language in favor of quantifiable results. The laboratory, once a place of occult wonder, became a space of measurable reaction and precision tools. Alchemical instruments, crucibles, Olympics, furnaces evolved into the backbone of modern chemistry. The dream of turning lead into gold faded, replaced by the practical pursuit of understanding matter's building blocks. And yet, the alchemical worldview didn't entirely disappear. The notion that matter can transform, that systems contain hidden patterns, and that humans can shape the natural world through deep understanding. These alchemical ideas quietly endured. They simply dressed in lab coats instead of robes. By the 18th century, alchemy was largely dismissed as pseudoscience, but history isn't so tidy. The truth is, modern science was built on alchemical bones, and the alchemists, with all their strange symbols and impossible dreams, did more than tinker with metals. They asked the fundamental question: can the world be changed? And that question still drives science today. By the 19th century, alchemy had seemingly vanished, dismissed by rational thinkers as a quaint relic of pre-scientific superstition. Like mercury in a flask, its essence never truly disappeared. Instead, alchemy transmuted, finding new life in psychology, literature, art, and even modern spirituality. The most surprising inheritor of alchemical thought, Carl Jung, the Swiss psychologist. To Jung, alchemy wasn't about literal transmutation. It was a symbolic map of the human psyche. He studied alchemical texts obsessively, recognizing in their cryptic diagrams and metaphors a language of the unconscious. The philosopher's stone became a symbol of self-actualization. The alchemical process, calcination, dissolution, fermentation, coagulation, mirrored the psychological journey toward individuation, teach the integration of all aspects of the self. Alchemy, Jung believed, was the original therapy, a coded spiritual practice disguised as proto-chemistry. Its real aim wasn't to make gold, but to heal the soul. Yuval, and in this sense, alchemy never stopped evolving. In literature, it lives on in works like Faust, The Alchemist, and countless fantasy stories where hidden knowledge, transformation, and redemption take center stage. In modern spirituality, alchemy serves as a metaphor for personal growth. The idea that life's suffering, if refined, can produce wisdom and wholeness. Even in science, echoes remain. The dream of alchemy, to understand and master the transformation of matter, finds a curious reflection in nuclear physics, where elements really can be transmuted. The alchemists were wrong about how it works, but not that it was possible. And culturally, we still chase alchemical goals, the search for a cure-all medicine, the pursuit of eternal youth. The fascination with the hidden, the symbolic, the transformative, the enduring power of alchemy lies not in its failed recipes, but in its imagination, its willingness to believe that the world is mutable, that what is base can become noble, and that knowledge properly applied can elevate both matter and soul. Chapter 1. Alchemy in the Age of Reason. When the 18th century dawned, Europe was entering what would later be called the Enlightenment, the Age of Reason. Philosophers, naturalists, and scientists raised the banners of rational inquiry, insisting that only what could be measured, observed, and tested was worthy of belief. To them, alchemy, with its coded texts, secretive brotherhoods, and shimmering metaphors, looked like a relic of superstition. And yet, even in this supposedly rational era, alchemy refused to vanish, didn't disappear. It transmuted, as it always had. Some alchemists, unwilling to surrender centuries of tradition, went underground. They folded their arts into esoteric societies. The Freemasons, the Rosicrucians, whether real or imagined, and a growing number of secret brotherhoods that promised hidden wisdom. Within these groups, alchemy became less about furnaces and more about symbols. The transmutation of lead into gold was still spoken of, but most now understood it as allegory. The base lead of the human soul must be purified, refined, and elevated into spiritual gold. Others, however, tried to keep alchemy in dialogue with science, even after Robert Boyle had declared the old four-element model obsolete. There were those who clung to the idea that matter had secret potentials, that some quinta essentia could be unlocked. In the laboratories of apothecaries and private scholars, retorts still bubbled. Metals were still melted, and strange powders were still sought. The paradox of the Enlightenment was this: while its thinkers demanded clarity, many of its greatest minds were still haunted by alchemical dreams. Take Isaac Newton. By day, he was the model of rational inquiry, the discoverer of gravity, the mathematician of the cosmos. But in the privacy of his chambers, he filled notebook after notebook with alchemical experiments, coded recipes, and mystical reflections. He studied ancient manuscripts with almost religious devotion, convinced that alchemy held the key to the divine structure of the universe. To Newton, the cosmos was a clock, yes, but it was also a mystery machine, powered by forces he believed alchemy might one day reveal. Newton was not alone. Thinkers across Europe quietly walked the line between reason and mysticism. To admit alchemy publicly was often dangerous for one's reputation. It risked ridicule. But in private, curiosity still burned. And beyond the ivory towers, ordinary people had no such hesitation. Farmers still sought elixirs. Merchants still dreamed of instant wealth from transmutation. Healers still sold tinctures that promised health, longevity, or even rebirth. Alchemy had lost the spotlight, but its flame still glowed in the shadows. Chapter 2. Revolution as Alchemy. By the late 18th century, another transformation was brewing, not in the laboratory, but in society itself. Across Europe and the Americas, revolutions erupted. The American Revolution, the French Revolution, uprisings in Haiti, Poland, and beyond. To the revolutionaries, the language of alchemy proved irresistible. What was a revolution if not the transmutation of society? The leaden weight of monarchy and tyranny was to be dissolved, calcined, purified through fire and blood, and reborn as the golden promise of liberty, equality, and fraternity. Revolutionary thinkers borrowed alchemical language freely. They spoke of the new dawn, of purification, of transformation through fire. Secret societies, like the Freemasons, whose rituals drew heavily on alchemical and hermetic symbols, played quiet roles in revolutionary politics. Again, in the secret chambers, where men swore oaths under candlelight, the rose, the cross, and the philosopher's stone were invoked alongside calls for justice and freedom. In this way, alchemy seeped into political imagination. It was no longer about crucibles and retorts. It was about human destiny. Nations themselves became metals to be purified. The irony, of course, was that just as alchemy was being discarded by science, it was being reborn in politics, philosophy, and culture. Chapter 3. The Occult Revival. The 19th century brought yet another shift. Rational science marched forward. Chemistry, biology, physics, all advanced at staggering speed. So the rational mind, alchemy, was dead at last. Teach was mocked as medieval nonsense, a curiosity for historians, not a pursuit for serious men of knowledge. And yet, in the cultural underground, alchemy rose again. The 1800s saw a sweeping occult revival. Across Europe, interest in hidden knowledge, astrology, Kabbalah, Hermeticism, spiritualism, surged. Secret societies flourished. Theosophy, founded by Helena Blavatsky, wove Eastern mysticism with Western esotericism. The Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, formed in London, drew upon alchemical imagery in its elaborate magical rituals. Alchemy, in this context, was no longer about transforming metals at all. It was a spiritual science, a sacred key to inner awakening. Authors like Eliphas wrote of alchemy as the ultimate magical art, while occult lodges taught initiates that to pursue alchemy was to pursue the perfection of the soul. The dream of gold had shifted entirely inward. The philosopher's stone was not a mineral, but a state of being. So, even as chemists in pristine laboratories dismissed alchemy as myth, poets, mystics, and occultists breathed new life into it. Chapter 4. Alchemy and the Romantics. By the early 19th century, Europe was still trembling from the aftershocks of revolution and war. The Enlightenment had exalted reason. The Industrial Revolution was reshaping society. But amid the smoke of factories and the rigid logic of machines, the Romantics turned their eyes back to mystery, myth, and symbol. For poets like Goethe, Shelley, and Novalis, the language of alchemy was irresistible. Goethe's Faust placed the archetype of the alchemist at the center of the drama, a man who craved forbidden knowledge, willing to bargain with the devil to gain it. In Frankenstein, Mary Shelley gave us a modern Prometheus whose experiments with life echoed the old dream of alchemical creation. These were not literal accounts of men melting lead into gold. Instead, they were moral alchemies, stories of transformation, hubris, and the dangerous seduction of hidden wisdom. To the Romantics, alchemy was not superstition. It was a poetic truth, a reminder that the human soul itself longed to transform. Chapter 5. Jung and the Inner Gold. Fast forward to the early 20th century. Science had advanced so far that alchemy seemed not just obsolete, but laughable. Yet, it was in this century that one of the most unexpected voices reclaimed it. The Swiss psychologist Carl Gustav Jung. Jung did not see alchemy as chemistry gone wrong. He saw it as psychology disguised in symbols, in the cryptic diagrams of furnaces and retorts, in the metaphors of dissolution, fermentation, and rebirth. Jung recognized patterns of the unconscious mind. He argued that the alchemists, without realizing it, were projecting their inner struggles onto matter. Their quest to purify metals was actually a quest to purify themselves. The Philosopher's Stone, Jung believed, was not a literal substance, but a symbol of individuation, the process of integrating the hidden aspects of the psyche into a unified whole. For Jung, alchemy was not superstition at all. It was a map of the soul, and his interpretation transformed psychology. Through him, alchemy re-entered the intellectual mainstream, not as failed science, but as eternal metaphor. Chapter 6. The Alchemy of the Atom. But alchemy was not only reborn in psychology. In a strange twist, the dream of turning one element into another, long mocked as impossible, came true in the 20th century with the discovery of radioactivity and later nuclear physics. Scientists learned that the very atoms of matter could be split, fused, and transmuted. Kata, lead, could not be turned into gold in a crucible, but in a particle accelerator. Keys, though at a cost far greater than the value of the gold itself. The irony was not lost. The alchemists had been wrong in their methods, but not entirely in their dream. Matter could be changed. Substances could be reborn. Humanity now wielded a kind of nuclear alchemy, able to turn the fabric of creation itself inside out. But with this discovery came terror. The Philosopher's Stone, once dreamed of as a source of immortality and abundance, reappeared as the atomic bomb, a power to destroy cities in a flash. Humanity had found transmutation, but it was as much curse as gift. The old alchemical warning echoed: transformation without wisdom is disaster. Chapter 7. Alchemy in modern culture today. When we hear the word alchemy, we no longer think of secret laboratories filled with bubbling flasks. Instead, we think of metaphor, mystery, and magic. Alchemy thrives in literature and film, from Harry Potter's Philosopher's Stone to Paulo Coelho's The Alchemist. The idea of hidden transformation still captivates the imagination. Alchemy shows up in video games, novels, music, and art, always as a symbol of hidden potential, of secret knowledge waiting to be unlocked. In spirituality, modern seekers use alchemy as a metaphor for personal growth. Retreat centers, meditation teachers, and self-help books speak of inner alchemy, the process of refining pain into wisdom, fear into courage, suffering into insight. The furnace is no longer made of brick and fire, but of life itself. Even in science, the echoes remain. Genetic engineering, nanotechnology, artificial intelligence, each carries whispers of the old dream. To take what exists, to refine it, to transform it into something greater. The alchemical imagination never died. It merely changed form. Chapter 8. The Eternal Flame. So what, then, is alchemy today? It is not superstition. It is not failed chemistry. It is not even only history. It is a way of seeing the world, one that insists transformation is possible, that the base can become noble, that suffering can become wisdom, that humanity itself, however flawed, can be refined. Every time someone enters therapy and emerges healed, every time an artist turns grief into a masterpiece, every time a scientist takes chaos and finds hidden order, the alchemical dream lives on. The Philosopher's Stone is not a mineral, right? It is a metaphor for becoming whole. And maybe, just maybe, that is why alchemy refuses to die, because it was never just about gold. It was always about us. Chapter 15. Alchemy's philosophical heart. At its core, alchemy was always about relationships, the hidden connections between matter, mind, and spirit. Medieval alchemists saw the universe as a living web where metals mirrored planets. Plants reflected human temperaments, and transformation in the lab mirrored transformation in the soul. Alberta Magnus wrote of the divine harmony present in all things, and Roger Bacon insisted that observation and experimentation were ways of reading God's handwriting in creation. Cation In their eyes, every retort, every crucible, every distillation wasn't just a chemical experiment. It was a dialogue with the cosmos. These thinkers wrestled with paradox. How could something base become noble? Here, patience was alchemy's secret ingredient. The slow burn of attention, flexion, and observation, which modern scientists might recognize as the ethic of careful experimentation. Chapter 17. Pioneers. Newton, Boyle, K. In the Alchemical Mind. The story of Isaac Newton illustrates how closely alchemy and science were entwined. His notebooks reveal experiments with mercury, gold, and obscure substances, attempting to decode nature's hidden laws. You didn't see a contradiction between gravitation and alchemical transformation. Both were expressions of universal order. Robert Boyle, the father of modern chemistry, blended empirical science with alchemical theory. He rejected the Aristotelian for elements, but believed in the potential transmutation of metals, using careful experimentation to test theories. The modern chemist's laboratory, precise instruments, controlled reactions, careful recording evolved directly from the alchemist's workshop. Even as the quest for gold faded, alchemists had left a critical legacy. The idea that matter is changeable, analyzable, and interconnected. Today, chemistry, pharmacology, and material science owe their origins to alchemical thought. Chapter 18. Alchemy as Psychological Map. Carl Jung transformed the understanding of alchemy by shifting its focus inward. The symbols of alchemy, the black stage, the red stage, the philosopher's stone, became metaphors for psychological processes. Jung observed that the alchemical texts were coded manuals for the human mind, exploring shadow, ego, and self-realization. Just as metals were refined, the psyche could be purified and integrated. Even technology is alchemical in its way. Code transforms ideas into virtual realities. AI transforms data into intelligence. Social movements transform discontent into social reform. Human ingenuity remains driven by the same impulse that led medieval alchemists to seek hidden patterns and new possibilities. In this sense, alchemy never left us. It's evolved, entering every aspect of life where transformation is possible: mind, body, society, and culture. Chapter 25. Closing reflection. The story of alchemy is the story of human imagination, perseverance, and the relentless pursuit of transformation. It shows that even failed experiments can be stepping stones. Even symbols can carry truths. Even fire and lead can illuminate the path to gold. Not the gold of currency, but the gold of understanding, creativity, and self-realization. Every time you struggle, grow, create, or heal, you enact the alchemical process. Every act of transformation is humanity practicing its oldest, most mysterious science. Alchemy didn't die. It simply transformed, okay? In that sense, it is eternal.